Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to introduce Dr. Cornell from the University of Virginia's Corey School of Education. I've worked closely with Dr. Cornell on many issues over the years, and I'm pleased to see him testifying here today. His testimony in this hearing are unfortunately relevant today in the wake of the shootings at Virginia Tech on April 16th. Virginia Tech held its commencement ceremony this past weekend, and although the physical and emotional scars from this horrific day will continue to affect students and faculty for a long time to come, I'm hopeful that this is the first step in restoring a sense of normalcy and healing to the campus. Dr. Cornell is a forensic clinical psychologist and a professor of education at the Corey School. He is also a director of the UVA Youth Violence Project and a faculty associate at the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy. He has 24 years of experience evaluating juvenile and adult offenders, including in the area of school shootings. He's testified in legal proceedings, consulted with the FBI, and authored over 100 publications in psychology and education on these matters. From his work, Dr. Cornell has developed threat assessment guidelines that are being used throughout Virginia as well as other states, and these guidelines are meant to assess the actual threat of incidences in schools in order to help schools evaluate the severity of threats and respond in a targeted and appropriate manner. He is widely respected in his field, and I'd like to thank him for traveling here today to provide testimony about his work on school violence, and I look forward to hearing his recommendations. And again, thank Dr. Cornell, and thank you, Chairman Miller, for the opportunity to introduce him today.
In 1999, I assisted the FBI in its study of school shootings, which recommended that schools use a threat assessment approach to prevent school violence. Threat assessment is a standard law enforcement approach developed by the Secret Service and used in many different settings. Threat assessment involves identifying a threat, evaluating how serious it is, and taking action to prevent it from being carried out. My colleagues and I developed and field tested a threat assessment procedure for primary and secondary schools that can be extended to colleges. I'm going to talk first about school safety and then about threat assessment. Pardon me for speaking quickly. I've got a lot to cover, and you know how professors love to pontificate. In response to every school shooting, there are calls to increase security and even to arm teachers. Such recommendations focus on crisis response. But prevention cannot wait until the gunman is in your parking lot. I'm here today to emphasize prevention. We have to study the problem objectively and make sure that our responses are not skewed by extreme cases. After Columbine, many schools overreacted by expanding zero-tolerance policies so that students were expelled for actions as trivial as having a plastic knife in their lunchbox. Despite the recent shootings, scientific studies cited in my written statement demonstrate that schools are safe and that violence is decreasing, not increasing, both in our schools and on our college campuses. With the exception of this year, there are about 16 murders on college campuses each year. With 4,200 colleges, the average college can expect a murder on campus about once every 265 years. If you include murders in the surrounding community, off campus as well as on campus, the rate is about once every 9 years. Now, of course, we want the number to be zero. We want to prevent every single possible fatality. But we have to look objectively and recognize the challenge that is in front of us to deal with that lofty standard. But in addition to homicides, we have less severe but more pervasive forms of violence, such as bullying and fighting. And fortunately, a scientific review of more than 200 controlled studies has found that school violence prevention programs can reduce violent and disruptive behavior by about 50%. Funding for school violence prevention through the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools should be protected and expanded. Now, terms like school violence and campus violence, I think, are misleading because they imply that the location is the defining feature of the problem. We've had mass shootings in restaurants, but no one talks about restaurant violence. The focus on location leads to unrealistic efforts to make our open public places so secure that they're no longer open or public. So we cannot turn our schools into fortresses. The Virginia Tech shooting appears to be the act of an individual who was paranoid, delusional, and suicidal. This shooting represents a mental health problem more than a school problem. Our nation suffers from poor insurance coverage for mental health services and from poor communication and coordination among those services. Even when we know someone needs treatment, there's no effective mechanism to make sure the treatment is delivered and no follow-up to make sure that it was effective. College campuses see many students with serious mental health problems, yet their staffing levels and resources are limited and focused on short-term treatment. Now, both the FBI and the Secret Service recommended a threat assessment approach because in almost every school shooting, the violent student recommended or communicated his intentions well in advance. At the University of Virginia, we trained threat assessment teams in 35 schools for a field test, and each team included a school administrator, a psychologist, and a law enforcement officer. Although serious acts of violence are rare, threats are very common, and in 1 year, these teams investigated 188 student threats of violence. All the threats were not the same. About 75% were just statements made in anger or jest that could be readily resolved with an explanation, counseling, and apology. The remaining 30% were more serious, and usually they involved one student threatening to fight another student. But we also had threats to shoot and kill that were resolved. In these cases, our teams conducted a safety evaluation that included both a psychological assessment and a law enforcement investigation. Every threat signals a problem that should be addressed before it escalates into violence. And in our follow-up study, we found that none of the threats were carried out. Just 6 students were arrested and 3 were expelled, which is much better than if the schools had used a zero-tolerance approach. A study by the American Psychological Association found that zero tolerance has a damaging effect on student achievement and no evidence that it makes schools safer. So over the past 5 years, we've trained thousands of school teams in a dozen states. Memphis City Schools adapted our model and was able to resolve more than 200 threats without any known violent outcomes, and again, keeping almost all the students in school. But there's been no federal program designated to fund threat assessment research or training, and so when this committee works on No Child Left Behind, I'll hope you'll make threat assessment part of every college's comprehensive school safety plan. Let me wrap up by saying that threat assessment can be extended to colleges, even though it's easier to monitor and supervise a high school student than a college student. Threat assessment is used in business and industry to prevent workplace violence, so this challenge can be overcome. In closing, our schools and colleges are safe, but in a large nation with thousands of schools, even rare events will occur with troubling frequency and skew our perceptions of safety. We must avoid overreacting to rare events and make better use of prevention methods, including threat assessment. Thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony. I'm pleased to answer any questions.